Good morning. Congratulations to you, the alumni, to your families, to faculty. Well done. Now, I've spoken to this class before, so that was another incentive for me to come here. And so I thought, instead of coming here and tell you nice things, I'm going to give you yet another lecture as you leave. And I'm going to talk to you about three things. The first thing I want to talk to you about is the landscape in which you're moving into. And I want to look at it from the perspective of the last 10 years and the last 30 years. Believe me, I will not be long. But I want to end that by coming to what Fred said, because yesterday him and I discussed this. Yes, you do hard things. But I said to Fred that there's a writer whose name I cannot recall, who has made a distinction between hard things, complicated things, and complex things. And I think you're walking into a world where you'll have to do all the three. And I'll come to that near the end of my conversation. So let me talk about the last 10 years. I don't know, is this thing visible? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. What I'm sharing with you there is the story of Africa as told by a distinguished publication called The Economist. Just see what they have said about Africa over the last 10 years. They begin off by saying we're a hopeless continent. Is that right? In the year 2000. Then they move on, Africa rising. They move on about $1 billion opportunity. I discussed that with you last time. And only last week, they came up with a story about a new scramble for Africa and why Africans can win this time. And I want to reflect on such a changing story in only 10 years, what it says about this continent. But let me jump straight ahead and this how it works. So here I join Fred in telling you why perhaps this publication talks about the scramble for Africa. That is the reason. You can take a look at this figure later, Africa today, and what it will be in a couple of years' time. But I want to spend some time on this, and this one talk about the last 10 years. The last 10 years has been truly cataclysmic in world history. So what I want to share with you there is the story of 2008, when the global economy almost came to what I like to call a near-death experience. A near-death experience, and I mean it. I was the president of the African Development Bank at the time. I recall there's a time I passed 3 nights without sleeping because we were managing billions of money of Africans and our shareholders, and we had to look after it. However, people came together. Enemies came in the same room. I was privileged to attend almost all the G20 summit, including the first one in London, where enemies came together in the same room, were in the G20, of course, not very representative, and they took measures which saved the world. And I'm using the word saved the world seriously. So what was initially a banking crisis, then became a financial crisis, and then economic crisis. These people made sure it never became a socio-political crisis. This is only 10 years ago. Now, fast forward, in 2015, the same people now joining with the rest of the world did something even better. The Sustainable Development Goals, agreement on climate, and agreement on financing for development. An agreement which some people have referred to it as perhaps the most important year since 1945, building a new global architecture of how we want to live on this planet. That was 2015. Then we come to 2016. That is the last slide there. There's this famous German philosopher, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Friedrich Nietzsche. Is that how they pronounce it? The one who said, I do my philosophy with a hammer. I don't have time to go through why I said that. It was about questioning the values of every age, every time. But truly in 2016, somebody turned up with a hammer. And he happened to be the president of the United States. Now, not him as an individual, but supported by many people unhappy with globalization as it is today. Questioning every institution, the United Nations, WTO, sometimes even NATO. Questioning all the institutions which have been in place since 1945. And as a result, today, we're in a world where the institutions we have relied upon since 1945 are all in question, because people are unhappy with globalization, either because they believe that the benefits have not been shared, or the pains have not been well managed, are up in front. They're in the form of Brexit, they're in the form of trade wars, they're in the form of questioning the Paris Climate Agreement, all forms. This is the world you're moving into. This is the real world you're moving into. And that's the reality of the last 10 years. From a global financial crisis, where people work together to contain it, to the great ambitions of 2015, now to 2016, which we're still living with today. Who knows where the world is going in 2020? How will the United Nations be functioning? How will the world function without multilateral agreements? And to show you how this is serious, for the first time in the last 30 years, and that is my next story, for the last 30 years, the prospects for global economic growth are very somber. Whether it is the Eurozone, Germany just escaped a recession. Most of the European countries are just struggling. Because for the last 30 years, what has driven the global economy has been China and the emerging markets. These are the countries which have carried along the dynamism of economic growth. But China this year will see the slowest growth in 10 years, 6.3%. Now, that is still very big. Many people would be very envious of 6.3%. But it's from 6.6, 6.3, still big given the compounding effects. But it's the slowest in 10 years. Global trade in 2018 began off growing reasonably, but this year the growth in global trade is almost nil, zero. Not because of the trade wars, which I think will be contained, but I think because of a combination of factors which we don't have time to go into. That is the real world in which you're moving into. But how is Africa doing? Because I heard you, Fred, talking about how great we are doing. I'm showing you there Africa's top economies. I don't know if this thing is visible. Those are the top economies in Africa. I just picked 10, I think. Part of the problem we're having is that some of those economies are not doing very well. They are performing suboptimal for reasons which I don't have time to go into. And as a result, you'll often hear figures of Africa's growth is 3.2. Actually, Rwanda here is growing at 8.2%. So there are many countries in Africa doing actually much better than the rest of the world. And my expectations is that they'll continue. But those top engines have to pick up. Those top engines are Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, and a few others who have been performing just about, sometimes below population. But once those economies pick up, I'm confident that this continent can weather this downturn in the world economy. Now, having said that, again, back to my 30 years, but I want to tell you something else which you should see there. That in the last 30 years, for the first time in the history of humanity, poverty has fallen from what was then, about 30%, to below 10%. Again, because of what has happened in China, India, and many emerging markets. The number of poor people have gone from 1.9 billion people in 1990 to just about 750 million people. And never happened in global history. However, and that is the second reality you need to look into, economic growth does not always translate into well-being or necessarily into transformation. And that map, which I'll share with you, shows you those countries which have managed to convert economic growth into well-being for their people. In some countries, economies have grown, but that has not translated into well-being. And the reason is, again, without going into details, typically, if an economy grows by about, say, 2%, you would expect to translate that to 1% improvement in livelihood of people. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we do less than 1%. So 2% growth, but your translation into well-being is about 0.7%. There are a few countries there who actually are managing to translate economic growth into prosperity. Rwanda is one of them. It's very small on the map there. It's not visible. But you can see places like Namibia, Cape Verde, and a few others. You can look at this map later. But just look at the one who has done miracles on translating economic growth into well-being, and that is the darkest there. It is China. So that is the other reality we're walking into. A lot of progress has been made, but we have two challenges. So that is one. Creating all these great companies, how do you translate into well-being for people? And here is something I wanted to share with you. I can leave you this map. I mentioned that the number of poor people has gone from 1.9 billion to about 750 million. But what that chart shows you that most of those 750 million are in sub-Saharan Africa. So the locus of poverty will have shifted from South Asia to sub-Saharan Africa. And that is another reality you're walking into. However, I'm teasing you with that. You can take it the way you want it. We have issues with data, which you'll have to interpret. But I want to leave you that thought, that the last 10 years, you have had these tectonic shifts. And then the last 30 years, you have had this emerging picture. And that is the reality you're walking into. 1.9 billion people to 750 million, but most of them in Africa, about 420 million. So which means basically, as the World Bank report said a couple of months ago, there will be now, today as we speak, the highest number of poor people is in India and South Asia. So in the coming few years, by 2030 thereabouts, there will be many more poor people in places like Nigeria, in sub-Saharan Africa, than South Asia, by the act of demography alone. So those are the realities you're walking into, and why this is important, and then I will end my long story. Go back to Fred and the hard things. Doing hard things is very important. And what you have learned here, the skills you have acquired, will enable you to do hard things. But the hard things require what? That you work smart, you work harder as you have done. But then there are complicated things. Complicated things, if you want to drive a submarine or create a jumbo, it's complicated, but you can learn it. It may take time, but it's complicated, but you can do it. But there are things which I mentioned to Fred, this is what I call them complex things. Complex things, no one will teach you how to handle them. No one knows how to handle them. There's no book, no publication, there's no course about how you handle complex things. And I mentioned to Fred, an example of a complex thing is bringing up a young child. Every baby is different. The fact that Richard came before Mary, those skills might give you a bit of a hint, but every child will be different. You have to learn as you go. You have to be very patient. You have to be resilient. You'll make a huge number of mistakes, because that is the nature of the beast. It is complex. So I want to end with this thought, that the world you're going into will require that you work hard, you do hard things, that you resolve complicated problems, but that you keep learning until the day you go back to your make about how to handle complex things. That's what all of us are doing. And my association with ALU, with Fred, was that his concept was that you're going to be taught how to keep learning all your life. Look, the economics I learned when I was at school, a lot of it now is completely irrelevant. If anybody had told me there's something called quantitative easing, I would have thought he was crazy. That is, you bring down interest to zero, negative, to stimulate an economy. We never thought that was possible. But because there was a complex problem called the global economic crisis, people figured out how to handle it. Now, for example, those tools are no longer available. Interest at zero, at negative, places like Japan, places like Europe. They have managed to help on the unemployment side. The fiscal tools are limited because of debt. So now, to handle the current slowdown in the global economy, people will have to think again about how to handle that. And in that story, I believe that Africa will be a player, and you will be major players. So I want to congratulate you, your families, the faculty. Wish you well for what you have done, and I hope that the ideas I've just shared with you can be helpful in some ways. Congratulations once again, and thank you for welcoming me. Thank you.